Well, there was no preparedness, and there was no front. We didn't know where the enemy was, who he was, where he was. We had no idea. We had no maps. The only map that was available to, not only to me, but as far as I know, to the regiment, was the map that came off the back page of Stars and Stripes. And we went to Korea. We went there as second-class citizens. Second-class leadership, third-class training, fourth-class morale. And the results speak for themselves.
The Naktong River formed the western boundary of the area to which the UN forces had retreated. The North Koreans pressed in on them from the north and the west, through Taejon and Chinju. Guerrillas infiltrated through the lines. At the end of July, UN forces retreated across the Naktong River and destroyed the bridges. America had reversed the advantage in numbers the North had enjoyed, although the UN command continued to claim the contrary.
General Walker made the pronouncement, stand and die, or something like that. Of course, where I was, I thought we were already doing that.
MacArthur had appointed Lieutenant General Walton H. Walker to command the 8th Army in Korea. Walker personally directed the defense of the UN perimeter.
The men were pulling back not for a military reason, but psychologically they just had panicked. With that, he said, we've got to stop them. So the way in which we did it, I would fly over them at 300 or 400 feet. Then I'd chop the engine, put on the flaps. He'd drop the back door. And as I glided over the troops, maybe 15 or 20 feet off the ground with, of course, the engine idling, he would lean out and start yelling at them to stop where they were and start fighting.
With the UN clinging to a bridgehead, MacArthur was looking beyond Korea to Formosa. The outbreak of war in Korea had saved Chinese Nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek.
In the week preceding the North Korean attack, we had some reason to think that there might be an effort in Taiwan to take over the government by some of those in the military forces. Well, when the North Koreans did attack, we did what we could to discourage any such development in Taiwan, because Korea was enough of a complication on its own without having additional complications in Taiwan.
Chiang Kai-shek had offered to send 3 divisions to fight with the UN in Korea. Although welcomed by MacArthur, Washington refused. At the end of July, MacArthur visited Formosa ostensibly to discuss additional military aid for Chiang Kai-shek. The Allies and President Truman were worried that he might rekindle the Chinese Civil War and widen the conflict. The president sent his trusted aide, Averil Harriman, to Tokyo saying, "Tell MacArthur that I don't want him to get us into a war with the Chinese communists." Harriman was also asked to check on MacArthur's mental fitness for command. MacArthur tried once again to challenge the administration's position on Formosa.
Nothing could be more fallacious than the threadbare argument by those who advocate appeasement and defeatism in the Pacific that if we defend Formosa, we alienate continental Asia. To pursue any other course would shift any future battle area 5,000 miles eastward to the coasts of the American continent.
Truman was furious and made MacArthur withdraw the statement, although it had already become public. An important precedent was established. MacArthur had been forced to obey a direct presidential order and was publicly seen to be doing so. For the first time, the UN had acted decisively in a crisis, helped by American management of information from Korea and by the absence of the Soviet delegate, Yakub Malik, and the Soviet veto. But on August the 1st, the Russians returned, and their boycott ended. Though the Russians had supplied the North with arms, they stayed out of the war. The Americans continued to accuse them of complicity.
If now the Soviet Union would exercise its influence the breach of the peace would be ended forever. If now the Soviet Union would decide to respect the independence of its neighbors and live in true friendliness with the rest of the world, if it would prove its words by deeds, the fear that now grips the world would disappear.
A wave of anti-Russian sentiment swept the United States. A future president spoke for many ordinary Americans.
Ronald Reagan, the Screen Actors Guild president, follows with a statement of action against communism.
Let's for a moment forget the words communist and communism. Let's substitute the proper term, pro-Russian. Because the very doubts that we feel are doubts that were intended that we should feel by the men in the Kremlin. Communism, the greatest hoax of the century, was perpetrated on the world to cover and mask nothing more nor less than a program of Russian aggression and expansion.
By the beginning of August, America had 3 divisions in Korea. Though numerically superior to the North Koreans, UN forces were still unable to hold the front. The North Koreans took the east coast port of Yeongdeok. General Walker authorized a withdrawal further south to Pohang. There was no room for further retreat. Some of the Americans had developed a new respect for the North Korean soldiers.
The North Koreans were extremely well trained. They were extremely well organized, and they were tremendously motivated. They were there to make the fatherland look better, and they did. They had determination. They had everything that a soldier needs to acquit himself well.
America's answer to North Korean determination was firepower. And the pipeline, as the logistics support system became known, delivered increasing amounts of equipment. But firepower could not replace manpower. America urged its allies to send more. British Premier Clement Atlee seemed happy to support America.
We are faced with a direct challenge to the authority of the United Nations. An act of aggression has been committed. And if the United Nations organization was not to go the way of the old League of Nations, it was absolutely and imperatively necessary that a halt should be called.
The pressure on the Pusan bridgehead led General Bradley, chief of the American Chiefs of Staff, to say, we'd like anything. If you send a platoon today, it'll be worth a battalion tomorrow. So the British Army was under pressure to send some forces. They said, very well, we will send the British 29th Brigade, which is the Imperial Strategic Reserve. And they began to get them together, which meant calling up reservists and possibly extending national servicemen. And then they said, how long will they take? This was in August. Oh, they said, we think they'll be ready by November. Well, an exclamation mark was the response to that in Washington.
Britain had troops in the Far East. Some were tied down fighting the insurgency in Malaya, but there were others in Hong Kong. Hoping China would not attack its colony, Britain sent these units to Korea at the end of August.
Of course, all eyes were on the Argylls, as they always are and always will be, with the Scotsmen in kilts in a far country. And so they got all the bouquets and everything else. It was a fascinating sight, very unmilitary. And lots of odd American soldiers walking about or lying about. Don't know what they were supposed to be doing, but they were all very vociferous and vocal about how we'd arrived too late. It was incredible. It wasn't a kind of war picture that we British are used to. It was something out of, well, I don't know, cinema.
It was easier to get planes into action than ground troops. The UN continued to exploit its dominance of the air. The power of its strategic bomber force was formidable against a small country without an effective air force. All of North Korea and